Is Darwinian evolution true? Our culture, textbooks, and media says it is true. We'll be examining whether or not that claim can be verified or if it's false. Now, before we delve into Darwinian evolution, we have to understand that the origin of life with all of its diversity and complexity is supposed to have happened by chance. That requires a huge leap of faith with plenty of assumptions but very little evidence. In surveys all throughout America, in terms of to the American public, what makes God's existence less likely? Unguided chemical evolution, origin of life, and the Darwinian evolution are the most significant drivers of science-related erosion in faith of God. Incredibly, over 2/3 of atheists made origin of life their biggest reason, and why this is baffling is that the extreme complexity of life is the number one reason for people who are certain of God's existence. Now, two widely used textbooks about 20 years ago, and I don't believe they've changed. The book on page 277 said, "Biblical creation is religion and evolution is science." Page 14, "It is not necessary to distinguish between historical and operational science. Historical is events that have happened in the past. Nobody was around. There were a lot of assumptions made. It was a one-time happening." Now, when I get into biological evolution, we have to distinguish between two types. If you are asked, do you believe in evolution? Your response should be, what type of evolution are you talking about? Because it is a word with two different meanings. There is microevolution. That's the limited variation that we see. For example, you can produce 340 different breeds of dogs. The descendants and the ancestors came from the same kind. The evolution that we're really talking about that's not true is the macroevolution, and that is Darwinian evolution. Darwinian evolution is not change over time. Animals become extinct, and there are a lot of changes in the animal and even the plant world. And Darwinian evolution is also not variation within kinds. Dogs come in different varieties. Horses come in different varieties. The beaks of many birds have variation within that species. The variation that we see is new combinations of existing genes. In the slide to the left, mom and dad are there. They have each different genes, and when they produce an offspring, like a brother or sister, there's going to be variation, and you're not going to look identical. From the gray wolf, the common ancestor, through Europe, North America, China, and India, came the large variety of dogs. Now, the father of modern taxonomy, Carl Linnaeus, he was the son of a pastor, a devout Christian, and he came up with the system of kingdom, phylum, classes, orders, genera, species, and varieties. And within this criteria, he defined and classified animals. Now, over the years since the 1700s, it has been tweaked. And probably the only difference is genera became family, species became genuses, and varieties became species. Now, he believed that variation occurred within this group, within his species, because the Latin word for species is kinds. And he wrote in his book, we reckon the number of species as the number of different forms that were created in the beginning. And he's referring to the Genesis account, where God said in Genesis 1:24, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their various kinds." So God didn't create the lowest level species. He developed the Genesis, or the kinds. An observation is, if you look at the very bottom, we can make new variations within the genus and species, but not the family. Let's take the example of the wolf. The wolf is in the animal kind. The phylum is Chordata, has a central spinal cord, is in the class of mammals. And then it gets into the order of carnivora, which includes wolves, dogs, foxes, cats, and bears. Then we get into family, and we find that cats and bears drop off, but foxes are included. And then when we get down to the last two, the canis, we find that the foxes leave. And the reason why the foxes are not part of that, where you can reproduce according to your kinds, because the foxes have a different chromosome account. Foxes have 34 and dogs, for example, have 70. So the only area where you can have that variation within kinds is down at the current genus and species level. And their under species is your Canis familiaris, which means dogs. The wolves are in Canis lupus, but they still can interbreed. Now, Darwinian evolution, the one that we're talking about, claims there's a natural process which organisms change over time as a result of changes in inheritable traits. And they came from a common ancestor, a bacteria, and the tree of life, all living things, plants and animals, grew from that. And they basically believe all life is connected and related to one another because of this ancestry. Here's a statement in Live Science website. Evolution by natural selection is one of the best substantiated theories in the history of science, supported from evidences from a wide variety of scientific disciplines. We're going to be showing how totally untrue this remark is made. Darwinian evolution is not about similarity. It's about transformation from a common ancestor. And that transformation began with a single cell. From the first living cell that formed inorganic material, the DNA allegedly created a primitive form of plant life and also animal life. The first multicellular organisms were invertebrates, which lack a backbone. They would include shrimp, jellyfish, and insects. Back to the animal kingdom, the invertebrates gave rise to fish, which now have a backbone, blood, and all reproduce sexually. Then we have the fish eventually gives rise to the amphibians, where fins become legs. They have skin and lungs which allow them to breathe above water as well as below water. Then the amphibians give rise to a reptile ancestor with scaly skin and claws. They lay eggs on land, and some kinds have live birth. Then the reptiles give rise to birds. Scales become feathers. The avian lung is different, more of a flow-through airstream, a lighter skeleton, and major structural changes. The reptile ancestors often give rise to mammal ancestors. Major structural changes. Mammals are warm-blooded, have hair or fur, they give live birth, and nurse their young with milk. Now, a major change for mammals on land is they also gave rise to mammals that live in the ocean. The transformation of land mammals to marine mammals required a variety of different characteristics that was supposed to have happened by accident. First of all, they need blubber for ice-cold water, as they are warm-blooded. Water pulls heat from the body 25 times faster than air. Their legs become fins. They get their water from feeding, but they don't drink the salt water. The offspring are born tail first in water. This allows the mother time to nudge them quickly to the surface for air. They sleep without drowning. Now, in order to do this, when dolphins sleep, one half of their brain sleeps and the other half is awake with one eye open for predators. The active half of the brain ensures the dolphin surfaces for air regularly while the other half sleeps. They also take many naps, not 8 to 10 hours of sleep. It would seem to have a surviving mammal in the ocean, every one of these characteristics would have to be present at the absolute beginning. Now, if evolution is true, Then what are the mechanisms that generate all of these changes? Most people who believe the origin of life happened by chance do so because they believe that evolution is true. So let's look at the mechanisms of change that transforms an invertebrate into humans. Darwin evolution first assumes a highly complex living cell happened by chance. Reminds me of a Steve Martin answer to the question, do you know how to become a millionaire? Well, first you get $1 million. So what are the generative mechanisms of evolution? The first one is chance. We hear this word used a lot. Evolution happened by random chance. An animal is an accident of nature, a collection of chance mutations. Chance alone is the source of every innovation, according to a Nobel Prize winner. Chance creates nothing. It's just the mathematical probability of some other cause or mechanism occurring, but not chance by itself. It's not a biological force. It doesn't cause things to happen or act on anything. So the next mechanism is natural selection. There is no transformative ability. Natural selection is a process that eliminates existing animals, does not create significantly different ones. It explains the survival of the fittest, not the arrival of the fittest. It does not explain complex changes. Now here is natural selection at work, where the foxes are trying to find the least mobile and the easiest to capture. Let me kind of give you an example of natural selection at work. Here are two dogs. They have from their parents a long hair and a short hair. So typically they're going to come out as a medium-haired dog. And in their offspring, the different combinations, they can produce a long hair, a totally medium hair, and then a short hair. And let's assume that there was a cold ice age and the medium hair and the short hair dogs died off. And all we had were the long hair. And the long hair would produce other long hair dogs. Now, this is natural selection at work. Notice there were no new genes added, just the existing ones. Notice it was a loss of genetic information. Now we have fewer varieties and they're less able to adapt to their environment. And what there has been a reduction in the population pool. So the next item that they came up with, and this was early in the 1900s, they realized that natural selection by itself didn't have a transformative ability, was beneficial mutations in the DNA. And basically, without mutations, a change in our instructions on how we're made, evolution could not occur. Genetics is today the major battleground against secular explanations for the origin of life. To give an example of how complex it is, before a cell divides, it makes a new strand of DNA. So on the left is the original DNA. Within that replication process, it splits the two, and we now have two new strands of DNA that is made. According to the explanation, mutations are copy errors, and they basically degrade the information contained in the DNA, which carries vital instructions for the maintenance and reproduction of cellular life. All creatures experience mutations. Mutations can cause disease or death, but the vast majority of mutations have no effect on the organism. There's two types of cells, and all cells within your body, with the exception of your sex cells, have a pair of chromosomes, your muscle. And there's 220 different types of cells in your body: muscle, bone, nerve, blood, liver, skin, cardiac, connective, dental, etc. And then here are your gamete cells, or your sex cells. female is the egg and the male is the sperm. Only mutations that are passed on can occur in the sex cells. They're the only ones that are passed on to your offspring. Now, in a bacteria, the amount of information, if you could put that into a book, 500 pages each, you would have to create, in that early ancestor, 2 books of coded information. The human has about 2,000 books. So in order to go from bacteria to a human, you have to increase the number of information by 1,000%. Now, the first computer game that came out was Pong. It was written by programmers. It had a set of basic instructions and code in order to make it work. Today we have John Madden football with all of these NFL teams and doing so much more. If this theory of evolution is true, by making random changes to Pong, you could end up with John Madden football without any intelligence being involved. Now, there have been 3 recent nails in the Darwinian coffin on the theory of evolution. 1, mutations causing new body plans have to be made while the organism is developing. The gene network controlling development are resistant to change. And number 3, and until about 10 years ago, the scientific community believed that 90% of DNA, which does not really code, and they thought had no purpose, they called it junk because it didn't code for proteins, and they basically said it was an evolutionary leftover. It is now recognized, even though it doesn't code for proteins, as a higher level of information that controls a lot of functions within the DNA. Now, here was a major discovery back in 1980. It was the DNA genome of the fruit fly. And Eric Weishaupt, excuse the pronunciation, and also his assistant, they were German microbiologists, and they won the Nobel Prize in 1995. They basically said new body plans have to be made by mutations during the embryo development. I mean, it's not like you're now an adult and then something mutates and you grow an extra arm. That type of major structural change has to happen while the embryo is being developed. But what they also found, if mutations occur in the early embryo stage of life, the development shuts down. In other words, the fruit fly dies. Advocates of evolution, they say that natural selection would select or keep beneficial mutations in the organism's DNA or their genome. Wrong. Natural selection never sees individual mutations. It only sees the entire organism. Your DNA is so sophisticated. This was 26 years ago, quality control by DNA repair. When copying errors are made, the cell has machinery that identifies and repairs to maintain the organism's genetic code. Although not error-free, genes not repaired are bypassed. This was in the science. Extreme changes in cell's environment, heat, UV radiation, activate genes that code DNA repair. Defects in this repair system can lead to hereditary form of cancer. What are we talking about here? We're talking about an enzyme machinery will check the new daughter DNA strand to fix or repair any errors. We're also talking about a programming exists to distinguish the original from the copy and not change the original. In the April 2011 magazine Discover, this PhD, who is an evolutionary geneticist, said, natural selection eliminates and maybe maintains, but it doesn't create. New mutations don't create new species. They simply create offspring that are impaired. So the question is, do beneficial mutations even occur? Jerry Bergman, PhD with 7 advanced degrees, did a 2004 study of beneficial mutations. He went through the biomedical research literature published from more than 4,000 journals, and it's an international publication. He found research on over 170,000 mutations, claimed to be beneficial 98.0006. All mutations resulted in loss of information. Now, here's an example of what Darwin used as beneficial. The Ancon sheep. Mutations caused short legs. Farmers bred them because they couldn't jump over fences. However, the mutation caused the cartilage damage and the sheep eventually went extinct. Next, we have fruit fly mutants. Their lifespan is pretty short at 40 days, and the females lay over 500 eggs. Since 1906, X-ray has been used to force mutations by 15,000%. They would go in and force mutations and record what would happen. And fruit flies reproduce quickly, and a generation is typically a week to just 10 days. So you get a huge amount of generations in a short period of time. They produced over 400 mutational features. Not one can be called a new species. The mutant flies were weaker, and when they compete with normal flies for food, natural selection kills them off. So, what are the generative mechanisms of mutations? So the results show mutations degrade DNA information, and there's no evidence of increased complexity. So what other evidence would falsify Darwinian evolution? So when we look at living things, and when we observe them and study them, does it look purposeful or messy? Do body parts look like proper fit and function, or do they seem cobbled together through a tinkering process? You don't have to be an engineer to appreciate that life looks like design systems. You can't escape the fact that they reflect design that bioengineers would envy because of their sophistication. However, the activists for the atheistic movement, Richard Dawkins, for example, an evolutionary biologist, said, living things are not just complicated, they look as though they are beautifully designed machines. Francis Crick, Nobel Prize winner for the DNA, stated, biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but evolved. Why do they state this? Because the observation of the evidence is breathtaking complexity in all living things. It shows the hallmark or signature of a designer. Now, evolution predicted evolutionary leftovers from lower ancestor. In other words, as you become higher up in complexity, there should be some leftover of useless items from your previous ancestor. One of those was embryonic recapitulation by Ernest Haeckel. And in 1866, he traced the evolutionary history of humans and a salamander and a tortoise and a pig and a calf. And you can see the similarity as they go through their evolutionary history. They look somewhat alike. However, about 7 years or 8 years later, they were proven fraudulent by Sir William Hist. And here's the top is the drawings of what Haeckel produced that is still in many textbooks 120 years later. This is what they looked like. But we see this, here's 2001, we see in this high school biology book, during certain embryological stages, vastly different organisms show similarities. And here you have the same fish, chicken, pig. And in a local newspaper in Riverside in 2001, critics point out the error in textbook about Ernest Haeckel's drawings. And Nature magazine even stated, to make young embryos look more alike, Haeckel removed the limbs from various embryos. We've known this for over 100 years. And Stephen Jay Gould, a Harvard biologist who's probably the most prominent advocate of evolution in the 20th century, said, "We should be both astonished and ashamed by the century of mindless recycling that has led to the persistence of these drawings in a large number, if not a majority, of modern textbooks." Here we see an honors biology book. Our embryos show our evolutionary history, referring to gill slits, yolk sac, and a tail. Here's the human embryo, and they said the folds there by the neck is a leftover of our gills, and we have a yolk sac like for a chicken, and then we have a tail like a monkey. The reality is the folds are not gills. It's the thymus gland, the middle ear, has nothing to do with breathing. The blood sac is for the baby. It's not like an egg yolk. And the tail is the end of the spine, the coccyx, and the spine has to end somewhere. And here we have 2002, Inside the Womb, Time magazine. It's not just in high school textbooks. At this point, a human embryo looks no different than a pig, chick, or elephant. All have a tail, a yolk sac, and rudimentary gills, like they were one time an ancestor from a fish. And there they show 44 days. So other leftovers that they market is vestigial organs. The encyclopedia, 50 years ago, said there were 100 vestigial organs in mankind: appendix, tailbone, tonsils, pituitary gland, body hair, adenoids, etc. In 2010, National Geographic News, vestigial organs not so useless after all, study finds. This was my son's high school biology textbook. Coccyx has no function. We have a set of miniature tailbones at the base of our spine, which obviously no longer supports a tail. However, you go to any college anatomy book, you see that about 5 ligaments are attached, and even on the tip of the coccyx, you see the anus attached. Then they also claim homologous structures. Homologous structures in that there's a similarity between the arm and the hand and the bones of a human, a horse, a cat, a bat, a bird, and a whale. This display was showing similarities. And in the textbooks, these different forelimbs evolved in a series of evolutionary changes that altered the structure of the arm and leg bones of ancient animals. Now, for a common ancestor to be true, structures have to be created by similar cells in the embryos or programmed by similar genes that would be passed on to each generation. We have known for over 50 years that these structures in the forearms are created by different cells and genes in different kinds of animals. This fact is not included in school textbooks. Sir Gavin De Beer, he's a British evolutionary embryologist, director of the British Museum of Natural History. He wrote in 1971, "Homology, an unsolved problem. It is now clear that the inheritance of homologous structures from a common ancestor was misplaced, for such inheritance cannot be ascribed to identity of genes. The attempt to find homologous genes, except in closely related species, has been given up as hopeless." Okay, the next item that they often use is the fossil record. In Chicago, 1980, 160 of the world's top scientists, and this was published in Science magazine, Evolutionary Theory Under Fire. The problem, according to most paleontologists, is that the principal feature of individual species within the fossil record is stasis, not change. Stasis is another word for stationary. The more scientists have searched for the transitional forms between species, Newsweek recorded, the more they have been frustrated. Everett Olson, a UCLA paleontologist, said, "I take a dim view of the fossil record as a source of data." However, you contrast that with Stephen Jay Gould, Harvard University, wrote, "The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, but it's not the evidence of the fossil record." So Darwin's tree, as you see here on the left, is not supported by the fossil record. Other examples, including the much-repeated evolution of the modern horse, have not held up under close examination. That was in biology, the unity and diversity of life. David Weishampel, PhD, who wrote the book on dinosaurs, paleontologist, Johns Hopkins University in 2012, wrote, "From my reading of the fossil record of dinosaurs, no direct ancestors have been discovered for any dinosaur species. Alas, my list of dinosaurian ancestors is an empty one." However, we will see that evidence from the fossil record indicates that modern-day birds, mammals, and reptiles descended from reptilian ancestors. And in the Honor Biology's book, a student brought it to me from Rancho Cucamonga, the evidence for macroevolution is extensive. The fossil record provides a clear record of continuous evolutionary change. All of these textbooks are in direct opposition to the scientific evidence of scientists. And then we have our ape to humans, and an ape is an ancestor, and our DNA is 99% similar. Well, let's take a look at that. In 1986, that's when we first heard this. Richard Dawkins, part of the New Atheist, said, "Chimpanzees and humans share more than 99% of our genes." About 15 years later was the first time that the initial drafts of the human genome research was announced. And 2005, almost 19 years after Richard Dawkins said this, was the chip genome research published. And then in 2005, the peer-reviewed journal in PLOS Biology, of the total number of gene sequences, 33% of the initial chimp data was not used as it did not align to humans. They felt the more accurate estimates is that the similarity is between 81 to 88%. Now, just kind of keep in mind, there is the similarity between a human and a banana is 50%. And the reason why it's somewhat close is when you go into the cellular level, there's a lot of housekeeping tasks, such as waste removal, absorb nutrients, maintaining a stable internal environment, that are shared with many different genes of different organisms. And finally, to put the nail in the head, Nature magazine in May 2025 completed the complete sequencing of ape, chimpanzees, gorilla, and they indicated the difference turned out to be 14.9%, not the 1% that they earlier had claimed. Let's look at how a belief that man came from apes influences the interpretation of the evidence. In 1974, a new discovery of a fossil was made claiming it was transitional between chimps and mankind. The remains were called Lucy, discovered in 1974. The fossil was found by Donald Johanson of the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. Their reconstruction shows a humanoid with lots of hair, and the creationists believe that this was not a human, but a bonobo cousin of a chimpanzee. And this is the Chicago representation. And that is what the creationists believe that this most likely resembles. Now, Lucy was 3 foot 6 inches tall, and only 40% of the skeleton was found. The skull was 1/4 human, and that's typically what the brain capacity of an ape is compared to mankind. And the teeth are chimpanzee-like. Long, curved fingers and toes were found by nearby fossils. They were not human in any form. Here is a chimpanzee hand and foot, and here is what was on display in the Cleveland Museum. And then here is the Chicago, which makes it look more human-like. The knee joint was interpreted to walk upright. Well, spider monkeys walk upright. There was not an intact knee joint found. Humans have a locking knee joint that enables us to stand and walk all of the times. Monkeys can do it only for a brief period. The heaviest bird is the ostrich, which doesn't fly. They can weigh up to 300 pounds. As you see in the photo, both an ostrich and human have a large heel and supporting bones and ankles to support their body weight. The ape does not. Very small ankle and very small heel bones. The humans also have long legs, center of gravity at the pelvis, an S-shaped curved spine so the head and trunk are balanced. The apes have longer arms than legs, a curved spine for walking on all fours. And the way you walk is tied to the hole in your head. As you see on the left, a dog is towards the rear. A chimpanzee is towards the rear. But the human is centered, and that is the opening for the spinal cord. When babies learn to walk, they do so at a very young age. They have a centered hole in the skull for the spine. They have an S-shaped spine to give balance. They have a locking knee. They have a large heel and an ankle for the weight. The chip bones are flatter and higher up. That enhances walking on all fours. Human hip bones form a lower three-dimensional platform that can support the vertically stacked organs. However, here's a 6th grade history book used in our public schools. There, the two men found an almost complete skeleton of an Australopithecus woman, and they named her Lucy. So we have an almost complete skeleton when the actual truth is it was only 40%. And they call it a woman. A woman is only a human female. And this is a history book. And finally, the last one is junk DNA. Now, the observation is that only 10% of our DNA is functional. The remaining 90% of our DNA, according to the secular assumption in our textbooks and the media, is that the 90% is useless, poorly constructed, and it's an evolutionary leftover that we no longer need. Francis Crick, the Nobel Prize winner back in 1980, said much of the DNA is little better than junk. Richard Dawkins says, what junk DNA is useful for is embarrassing creationists to make up a convincing reason why intelligent designers should have created a pseudogene. In other words, why would an intelligent designer create junk DNA? Kenneth Miller, in his high school textbook, said, the human genome is littered with pseudogenes, gene fragments, orphan genes, junk DNA, and so many repeated copies of pointless DNA sequences that it cannot be attributed to anything that resembles intelligent design. However, in 2012, the ENCODE project did a study of it. 442 researchers from the U.S., Japan, United Kingdom, and Spain. The U.S. contributed $185 million. And September 5th, they released their findings. And what they found is 80% of this non-coding DNA is active. Junk DNA contains 4 million switches that turn genes on and off. switches work differently in the various kinds of cells. And they felt like they've only unlocked 10% of the secrets. So Science magazine in September of that year, 2012, wrote, "The Uncode Project writes a eulogy for junk DNA." In the magazine circulation, junk DNA helps regulate biological functioning, including keeping your heart beating. Dennis Noble, PhD of Oxford University, wrote, "All central assumptions of the modern synthesis, which is neo-Darwinism, have been disproved." I'm going to repeat that. All assumptions of neo-Darwinism have been disproved. We believe that supernatural creation could be falsified. Show the origin of life by natural process. Show one confirmed instance of purely physical or chemical elements producing complex information found in the genetic code that is found in every living thing. Demonstrate evolution on a large scale. Breeding labs produce a cat or a zebra from a dog. Find solid transitional fossils. Nature magazine, in their publication in 2014, says, "Does evolutionary theory need a rethink?" The answer is yes, and urgently. I want to close with this final thought. Biodiversity, and that is the variety that we see of life with separate and unique design. Assume for a moment that there is a creator. What evidence would you look for? How much more complex world would life have to be before you conclude it wasn't by chance, but was created by a loving God who wants a relationship with you? And finally, if you believe still that there is no creator, you have to believe in these miracles. That order came from chaos without any reason. That life came from non-living matter by accident. The wide diversity that we see in plants and animals was pure luck. Consciousness came from something that had none. Intelligence came from something that had none.